Hello, everyone. This is Bernice from the International Association of Theatre Critics, and thank you so much for you all joining tonight for our special seminar series. This series is called the Critics POV, focusing on the Asia's contemporary performing arts, and this episode is focused on Singapore. Last week, we have two special guests talking about the 华语剧场在新加坡的状况。上个礼拜是华语的专场。For this week, we're going to have English seminar for a special topic on theater critics. And of course, you know all know about the multicultural context of Singapore. So that's why we are going to have a critics special for this special tonight, because we're going to talk about theater criticism in Singapore. And thank you so much again for Xiao Yi, Liu Xiaoyi, and two special guests. We have two ladies for tonight. And we are all critics. It's a party for critics tonight. We have Corey and also we have Carice. Thank you so much for joining us, and I know people are coming. And without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to Xiao Yi, because Xiao Yi is going to host for the seminar of tonight. And please feel free to drop your questions and also comments at the chat box. And later on, we will have some time for us to interact. Thank you so much. Xiao Yi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernice. And hello, everyone. My name is Xiao Yi. I'm from Singapore. Just landed in Shenzhen this afternoon. And welcome to today's seminar of theater criticism in the multicultural context of Singapore, organized by IATC Hong Kong. So this year, this program focuses on the development of contemporary performing arts of Singapore, and is divided into two sessions. Last week we had the first session, and today is the second. We hope that through these two sessions we can give some new insights to those who are interested in knowing more about Singapore theatre scene. So last week I invited two theatre practitioners from Singapore, Oliver Chong and Ray Paul, to share with our audience about the positioning and possible future development of Chinese language theatre in Singapore on the level of both practice and education. And this week is a little different. First of all, yes, last week we did in Mandarin, and this week we're going to do it in not Cantonese, but in English. Yeah. And last week, yes, the two speakers happened to be both male, and this week the two speakers are female, so we can balance things out a little bit. More importantly, of course, this week I have invited two theatre critics, as you can see on the screen, that I personally admire a lot. They are going to share with us some of their observations about Singapore theatre and some of their ongoing practice from the point of view of theatre criticism and archives. So first of all, please allow me to start by introducing them. First one is actually an old friend of mine, Dr. Corey Dunn. She has reviewed a lot of my shows for the past, I don't know, 10 years or 20 years, and we have actually worked very closely together a few years ago. Corey is a scholar, a critic, a dramaturg, and a facilitator from Singapore. She holds a PhD in theatre and performance studies. She's currently also a senior lecturer in fine arts, am I right? At NAFA, University of the Arts, Singapore. And she's also the incoming artistic director of the Asian Dramaturgs Network. Actually, can I say that? I can, right? Yeah, okay. And the next one is a new friend, Clarissa On. Clarissa is an arts manager, archivist, and writer from Singapore. She's currently Esplanad's head of communication and content. She manages this platform called Offstage. I think later she may talk to us about the work she has been doing on this platform. And yeah, here is today's rundown. So to give you some background information, in order to prepare for today's sharing, I listed some questions for both of them, and hopefully they will help both speakers. And so later, after my introductions, we were listening to Corey's sharing first, and then Carissa's. They will spend about 20 minutes each, and then we will have about 30 minutes or so for Q&A and discussion. So yeah, I would like to also invite the audience as you listen to their presentations. If you have any questions, difficult questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we will try to get the two speakers to respond to your questions later. If you are if you are not too shy, then later maybe you can just turn on your mic and you can just tell us your questions as well. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to invite the first speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Corey Dunn.
Thank you so much, Xiaoyi, for inviting both of us. And I'm really thrilled actually to be in conversation with Clarissa, who was my former boss at the Straits Times. I was telling Xiaoyi and Bernice earlier that she's the one who trained me how to write. And I'm very grateful to her for kind of nurturing me as a rookie reporter 15 years ago. So actually, Xiaoyi, Clarissa, and myself are all recovering from the flu. So we hope you will bear with us over the course of this evening. My sharing might be a little bit shorter than the 20 minutes, but hopefully that leaves more time for us to be in conversation with each other. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope everyone can see this. So I think Xiaoyi's invocation to us was to think about theater criticism in the multicultural context of Singapore. And I'm going to extend that a little bit further because I, throughout the course of my PhD and also the course of my practice as a critic, for the past 15 years, I've come to think of Singapore much more broadly as a key part of the Southeast Asian region. And also the different kinds of mobilities and connections and practices that critics in Southeast Asia, specifically archipelagic or maritime Southeast Asia, share. And that was actually a big part of my PhD, of which actually my work with Xiaoyi was a part when he was working on the Southernmost project with Emergency Stairs and inviting a lot of artists from Southeast Asia and East Asia to consider what this kind of interculturalism was. So one of the things I first wanted to introduce myself as is that beyond thinking about criticism in an English context or an English language context, which I think was Xiaoyi's kind of overture to us, I wanted to maybe think of it more as thinking of theater criticism in Anglophone context. What we inherited from these Anglo-American, Euro-American, Western lineages of criticism, and not that they are necessarily good or bad, but they are an outsized influence on the ways in which we think conceptually and philosophically about criticism, right? So the critic, I think, in that specific tradition is often considered someone who is an outlier, someone who's supposed to be an outsider to the scene, to have a kind of authority or expertise, a lot of cultural capital, a very refined or sophisticated sense of taste or discretion, which is often very much tied to socioeconomic class and educational background, in order to impose judgment or evaluate a work. And as I made my way through the English language mainstream media in Singapore, I grew increasingly uncomfortable with that notion. I myself never watched theater until I discovered what theater was when I was about 17 or 18 years old. When I joined the theater studies program at Victoria Junior College in Singapore. And prior to that, didn't have the access to or money to attend theater productions. And so it was an incredibly new thing to me. And I remember being kind of shocked by the emotional impact that performance had on me, both emotionally and physiologically. When I watch a show, I'm deeply emotionally involved in a production. I've described watching performance to my friends as feeling like I'm a huge tuning fork, picking up all the vibrations of emotions that I feel coming to me from performers and the stage, and just being in that shared space with people. And so I grew increasingly frustrated with the notion of the critic having to be this outsider figure. And if we think of critique in its kind of Western philosophical tradition, going back to Immanuel Kant or to Michel Foucault, the idea of the critic is someone who places themselves at an epistemic border or the edge of knowledge, right? Supposed to have more knowledge or more insight than others, to be able to assess a situation. And very often I thought, man, I'm not an expert. I feel like I'm discovering things alongside everyone else, right? Often a genre or an art form will be new to me. I'll be encountering it sometimes with the artists themselves as they explore a new part of their practice. And so a big part of my work, and the title of my PhD is actually called The Intimate Critic. And now I've come to realize that I make sense of art through intimate writing. I feel like that is a big part of what I do. I try to make sense of it alongside my reader, alongside the audience. And the only perspective I can bring to a work is what is accumulated in my body and what is my own. And that is the kind of disposition I often bring to criticism. And because being a spectator of performance is and when I develop critical responses to performance, it's such an emotional act for me, or an affective process for me. I often desire to be an architect of affect, and I have to credit my good friend, the curator, NUS Museum curator, Sid Perez, for this. Who describe me in this way. I like building the emotional, affective structures through which people can encounter work. And this is often through writing. I love doing this through writing, where my page, is the site of encounter for people. Whether I'm introducing a show to them or an artist to them, I love being the broker, that emotional kind of intermediary for a performance through my writing. And people have often described my writing as very tactile, very sensorial, and kind of deeply emotionally charged. So I enjoy that very, very much as a critic, which is also another thing that I think is in that kind of Anglophone tradition, traditionally frowned upon. Like, you're supposed to be outside. Why are you so emotionally involved, right? Why do you feel so deeply? It's uncouth to have these kind of big displays of emotion or tears or laughter, because I think we're kind of socialized to engage with art in a kind of very disaffected, disinterested sort of way. So I felt very deeply throughout my time with the mainstream media that I had a very different perspective on that. So these are some of the questions that Xiao Yi invited me to think about. I think I would be dealing with some of them quite broadly, and feel free to bring them up again after our presentations, and I'll be happy to engage with them if you feel that I've overlooked them in some way. But he asked, what difficulties and challenges arise when critiquing works in other languages, multilingual works, or cross-cultural works in English? Does English privilege exist in Singapore's theater and criticism circles? And what are your observations and insights on this? Is there sufficient exchange between critics who write in different languages? And what are the significances and challenges of such exchanges? And finally, and I think this was one of my favorite questions, as someone with multiple roles, how do you perceive the interactions between critics, artists, educators, and researchers in Singapore, and how do these interactions contribute to the development of cultural criticism? Just so some framing for us to think about. So I think I really wanted to move away because when we think in a specific language, I often think of language as a kind of world building. Different languages, I think, can offer us different philosophical or critical contexts or framings that are interesting to translate. I won't say impossible. I think there's always some kind of conduit or bridge we can find. It may not be precise or perfect, but I think that is also the joy and beauty of translating between contexts, that we can build different kinds of worlds or imagine different kinds of worlds based on the languages with we have most proficiency or most comfort in. And so when I started to think of language as world building, of course, I'm most fluent in English. That is my language of comfort, but I deeply enjoy languages. I'm quite promiscuous in my absorption of languages. I love picking up other concepts and framings from other languages that are new to me. And there are three maybe concepts that I wanted to talk about today that have really influenced how I think about language and world building and criticism. One was a paper I read by the academic Darren Schmidt, which really blew my mind. And he said, actually how we talk about the work is the work. And I think that gives the critic a great responsibility, because we are not just there to judge, assess, evaluate, reflect on a work, but our writing about the work creates the discourse around the work and how the work will be inherited by readers or by audience members. And so the work begins the moment you click on a ticketing link and read the publicity about it. The work has started, right? And the work I think to me doesn't end. Like you walk out of the theater, you discuss it with a friend, with a partner, with other people, you engage in commenting about it. Extends the lifespan of a work. So the critic, I think, contributes to that from a world building about a performance. And so that was a really key thing for me. And it made me think about, what is it that we review? What is it, do we only write about blockbuster pieces that are well attended by others? What about the smaller work, the works in progress? How are these pieces captured? Another big thing that shaped me was a conference co-organized by Nazri Bahrawi, who's now a Singaporean literary scholar, who's now at the University of Washington, and Elmo Gonzaga, who's from the Philippines, but is now based in Hong Kong. They did a conference called Doing Theory in Southeast Asia at CUHK. And it made me think, what are the concepts or theories in criticism that we take for granted? And what new things are we working on in Southeast Asia that can actually more accurately or precisely inform the work that we are doing in much more under-resourced, much more close-knit theater communities, very, very different from our Euro-American peers. What new forms of relationships or relationality have we formed that we are all collectively figuring out and embarking on together? What are these theories that we are doing here in real time? And the final one is by a theater critic from, well, he does a lot of things, but he's a theater critic from Indonesia, from Java, Benny Johannes, and he wrote a book, Method Kritik Theater, like methods of theater criticism, where he talked about the act of criticism as an act of weaving or knitting merajut between performer and audience, that I think the performer offers us the needle, the thread, and we activate the needle as spectators, and collectively we weave together this tapestry of encountering performance together. So this really kind of expanded, I think, initially what I thought about criticism or critique in the Western lineage, and I was very keen to develop other linguistic proficiency. So I actually learned Bahasa Indonesia for 3 years for my PhD in order to read more work and access more work. in multiple languages. And that was a really incredible experience. And I tried also to, there's a lot more work that I was reading in the Philippines that's available in English just because of different histories of colonialism and knowledge production. But Tagalog was also very important to me to think about different modes of critical world building, which I'm going to talk through a few key concepts that I kind of encountered during my PhD process in the next few slides. So these are three main things I want to talk through from the Southeast Asian context that I think expand Anglophone notions of doing criticism. So the first are the notions of kapwa and lo'op. This is from the Filipino context. So Virgilio Enriquez is a Filipino psychologist who was very active throughout the 1960s to 1980s. He developed something called Liberation Filipino Psychology because he realized that in treating a lot of patients in the Philippines using a Western framework, it made absolutely no sense in terms of the different kinds of kinship and familial and relational structures in the Philippines and the ways in which people related to each other. He was like, I need a whole different system of thinking about these things. So together with his students, he built an entire inventory of these kind of systems of relations. Some of them now, when we look back, are quite essentialist. So, you know, they assume that Filipinos will act in a certain way rather than thinking about ways in which people are socialized into these relationships. But I still found them really useful. So the notion of kapwa is that everyone has a kind of shared or collective identity. It's quite difficult to explain in English, but the sense is that there's no individual. We are always already in relation with each other. There's no way the critic can exist outside of their community. We are always already symbiotic or in relationship with each other. And this is created through lo'op or relational will. We have relational will towards each other that extends kind of infinitely. So lo'op can kind of be combined with other Tagalog words. So for example, there's utang lo'op. Utang is also a cognate word in Bahasa Malay and Bahasa Indonesia, which means debt. So if you have a debt of relational will with someone, you feel like, wow, they've done something really good for you. You feel contractually obliged in your relationship to pay it back to them, for example. And Pristine De Leon is a critic friend of mine based in Manila. And she was like, wow, if we think of the critic as kapwa, as someone who has a collective identity within the arts community, then the critic is always already intimate or symbiotic with every other member of the artistic community. And I thought that was really beautiful. The next thing is Perantau and Pelancong. So perantau, or the act of rantau, is an act of voluntary migration that is traditionally kind of a process that is specific to the Minangkabau tribe of Sumatra. And Mokhtar Naim is an Indonesian sociologist who studied this in the 1970s. It's an act of voluntary migration where a lot of members of this community would deliberately, so we think of involuntary migration. Let's say you have a war in your country, and then you are displaced because of conflict. You have no choice, right? It's involuntary. But voluntary migration is you decide, right, that you want to go and migrate somewhere else in search of education, a new job, cultural exchange. But the idea is that you return back after, right, to your home site. So it's a lot of people who are of Minangkabau, Minang descent often say, like, oh, I feel very itinerant, very nomadic. I always desire to travel, which is different from what Benny Johannes, the other critic, talks about as a pelancong, like just a tourist. You just, you just go somewhere for fun. You don't really get to know a place or a site deeply. And I thought of the critic as a perantau. What if we can think of the critic someone who travels instead of being a tourist to performance, someone who voluntarily migrates to the site of performance and spends deep time kind of residing with it, understanding it, and then returning back to the site of the page to write about it. So that's another way in which I was thinking about the critic through a Southeast Asian lens. And the final one, I think, is one of my favorites, which is derived from a dramaturgical concept from Indonesia Kelly Minardi is a dance scholar originally from Jakarta. She's also a dramaturg. And it's the idea of pendamping and pengganggu. Oh, actually, no, I should have done this a lot easier. Anyway, pendamping comes from the term mendampingi, to accompany, to be side by side with, to walk alongside with. And pengganggu comes from the word ganggu or gangguan, which is to interrupt, provoke, disturb. And Helly and her colleagues came up with these two terms when they were doing dramaturgical work with Indonesian choreographers. And I thought it was such a lovely idea. What does it mean to be both a companion and a provocateur to artists? And you can't just be one, right? If you're just a friend to someone and you don't point out or question the work they're doing, then you're just pandering to them. If you're just a provocateur, people might kick you out of the room. If you're constantly disturbing, interrupting, being very aggressive. So the fact that both these dispositions act together was quite exciting too. So I think these are the ways in which I was excited to think about the critic as going beyond Anglophone traditions of criticism. And we can discuss these a lot more later. Sorry, I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to move on to the next bit. But it was really exciting during my PhD process to encounter these very different frameworks across Southeast Asia, that also really confronted me, myself, as a critic and what I'd been trained to do, and how I could operate differently as someone who desired to do really intimate writing about a work, and to be able to come really close to a performance, but know when it was right to step away, right? You can't always be super close. Sometimes you need that level of distance from a work. So these contexts were really, really helpful. So I as a little exercise to myself and to kind of extend that linguistic metaphor, this segues into the multiple roles that I really enjoy. And I started to think about a lot of my work as a practice of extended criticism. So even if I'm doing mentorship, or I'm a researcher, or I'm doing dramaturgy, all of them, I think, inform the ways in which I desire to make sense of art through intimate writing. And so I was thinking, what are the, kind of my four main roles? And my job titles may be different, but these are the four main things that I think I kind of see myself as. And I developed like little sets of keywords of vocabulary for each of them. So as a critic, I was like, what do I do as a critic? Writing, encountering, witnessing, remembering, documenting, associating, archiving, contextualizing, connecting, relating, offering, responding, and a sense of responsibility. As a facilitator, there's dramaturgy, pedagogy, moderation, mediation, reflection, reflexivity, community building, questioning, conversation, activating, intermediary, responsive, and engaging. I also have a mentor role. I see myself more as a mentor than an educator, because I feel a bit uncomfortable about the factory line of education. So there's caring, cheerleading, journeying, empathy, accompanying, nurturing, envisioning, creating opportunities, developing, respecting, scaffolding, and hoping. And as a scholar, then I do theorizing, conceptualizing, interrogating, framing, ideating, historicizing, being public-facing, dialoguing, refining, revising, collaborating, learning, and unlearning. Then I looked at it and I was like, actually, are these bound to these specific roles? And what would it look like if sometimes I change them up a little bit? And I'm still working this out for myself. So I just mixed them up to see whether these different sets of keywords would fit my other roles. And actually they kind of did. And now I'm wondering, what are these different toolkits that we develop or we take for granted within each of these roles? But actually, how can they cross-pollinate the other things that we do, right? Like, what if a critic was caring and cheerleading, and hoping and developing? And what if the scholar was witnessing and remembering and offering and relating? So I started out, I just did this in preparation for this talk, and I don't really have all the answers, but it was quite exciting to me to see how these toolkits could work quite fluidly with each other. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I'm really curious to hear what people think about this later, and if you've also kind of developed keywords for yourself. But to end, I think at the moment, there are three big things that really guide my practice. I love thinking about the page on which I write, or the space in which I hold a discussion as a space of encounter. I think the moment of making acquaintance is so important, right? When we meet someone or something, or an artist or their work for the first time, how do I shape that encounter for other people if it's in the space of the text that I can offer to them? And once the reader has entered the space of my text, how do I host them? How am I a good host? How can I show both the artist and the reader a hospitality in the space of my writing as they are reading? Does it look like, me being able to create a textual or written journey for them from beginning to end? How do I introduce them to an artist's practice, whether I enjoy it or not? And most of all, how can I offer all of this from a space of abundance? I love the word abundance because you don't have to be financially abundant to be abundant. You can be very generous of yourself. And so these are the three things that I've been thinking about, I think, for the past 2 years. And the good thing about these words is that they can always change. And I'd be curious to hear if anyone wants to share later on what you feel, or maybe an exercise for yourself, what you feel your own keywords are for the different parts of your life. Yeah, and with that, I'm gonna, bring my presentation to a close. Thank you very much.
I want to send a reaction. Okay. Actually, I can do a real one. I'm always inspired whenever I hear Corey share. So thank you for your sharing. I often told people about our collaboration in 2018. I love the way Corey and I blurred and challenged the line between creation and critic, between artists and critics. And although you have moved on and developed beyond that experiment since then, but I think it's a very good case study. And I always think that we should review it and maybe do it again. To give you guys some background information, she was working as a critic in residence for the festival organized by me. And at the same time, she was more than that. In the rehearsal room, she was like a dramaturg. she was like an archivist in the rehearsal room. And she even contributed her voice as the voiceover for the actual show. And I remember that I said at the forum at the time that documentation is just the first step. And what's more important is how we critique our documentations and then how we analyze our criticism. And that's how we create a meaningful discourse. And I think Corey has been doing those 3 steps since then. So speaking of archives, I know that this is exactly what our next speaker, Carissa, has been thinking about and practicing for the past few years. So now let's turn the mic over to Carissa and hear what she transformed from a theater critic to more like a archives as critic approach. So let's welcome Carissa on.
Thanks, Xiao Yi. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. Thanks to Xiao Yi and Hong Kong's IA. Sorry, I think was I muted a while ago? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Xiao Yi, and thanks to the IATC for having me for this conversation. It's a real honor. I'm always very encouraged and very heartened, when I meet and I'm in conversation and dialogue with other critics, because there are not that many of us, and I think now increasingly many of us wear different hats now. So that's great. And I'm going to be talking about my overlapping roles as a critic and an archivist. A quick introduction. So I'm Clarissa or Claire. People who have worked with me, my friends, they call me Claire. I'm also a platform manager. I manage the Esplanade Offstage platform, which is an online arts education and content site on Singapore and Asia, focusing mainly on the performing arts. But I'll be speaking mainly about the critic and archivist hat in this conversation, and what it means to operate at the intersection, and also talking about some of the gaps in the landscape in these areas. I worked mainly I was a theatre critic, an arts journalist and a theatre critic for the first half of my career. That's how I knew Corey, and we worked closely together in the Straits Times newsroom. I was a theatre reviewer, so theatre is a medium that I am most familiar, most knowledgeable, in some ways the closest to my heart, and I grew up with it also as a theatre studies student as well. I'm also one of the earliest batches of students in Singapore to study theatre at A levels. But in recent years, I've also written about other performing art forms like music and dance, and I'll be referencing some of these as well in my sharing. So Xiaoyi also gave me, a list of questions and provocations like he did for Corey, and I think that's a very useful framework for what I'm about to share. So how do I believe archives and archival writing can become integral to cultural criticism? In archives and archival writing, how should one address multilingual and cross-cultural issues, aside from translation? Thirdly, with the advancement of technology, how can tech-integrated forms like video essays assist in archival writing? What are the future trends? So technology also is another area that I really had to grapple with, in archival documentation, and I'll be talking a bit about that. And then finally, beyond criticism and documentation, do I think Singapore has sufficient forward-looking discourse on the future development of culture and the arts? Okay, so I'm going to plunge right in. So the critic as archivist, what does that mean, right? How is an archivist different from a critic? What does it mean to operate at the intersection? So Corey, from her sharing, has given a very rich and considered answer to this question of what is a critic. And much of it, in terms of working, with a community I share. And my contribution to this conversation is that I believe, particularly in the Singapore context, that a critic also needs to be an archivist to some degree because of the paucity of documentation. And this a dearth of archival documentation, of recordings, of performances, of records of the history of performance, that was actually how I came into archival work in the first place. So when I started out as a young journalist, a young theatre reviewer, I actually had very, very few reference materials. And when I was in the Straits Times, I was asked to write a book on the history of Singapore's English language theatre through the lens of the Straits Times, which is Singapore's flagship newspaper, which had actually given extensive coverage to the arts, particularly in the earlier decades. So this historical this book essentially was through the lens of the Straits Times, but no such book-length historical record of English language theatre had actually existed before that. And after that, since then, there have been other books on the history of theatre in different languages in Singapore. So I'm glad to have contributed to that momentum. So critic and archivist, to further unpack this distinction, I'll refer to a few other kind of factors or criteria. So, conventional wisdom has it that, the archivist's role is to document the past, right? So the archivist is always linked to the past, while the critic is working from the standpoint of the present and also looking ahead to the future. However, in actual fact, the archivist also has to make decisions that have to do with posterity and futurity as well. So, in terms of, for example, how extensively do you want to archive a production or a project? whether it's photography or also video archival. If it's video archival, how many cameras, the quality of the recording, and all these questions actually concern the future. And so at Esplanade, for example, where I work and I help to manage the center's archives, Esplanade being Singapore's National Performing Arts Centre, some considerations involved in deciding whether to film a better quality archival recording would include whether we commission the work. So meaning these are performances we have invested in the creation of, and hence we would have some rights to an online screening. So that's one consideration if it's a commission. Also, how well documented the art form is. Is it important to future generations that we have a recording of this art form, and how significant the topic or artist is or can become? So these are all questions to do with the future. So the archivist actually also is very much linked to the future. Individual versus the community. Corey has spoken quite a lot about how the critic is typically seen as the lone wolf, kind of standalone commentator, right? Passing judgment or making value judgments about a work, and being somehow separate or divorced or independent from the community. Whereas the archivist is seen as collecting and documenting the memories, the materials of a community. So there's this dichotomy, right? I feel that the critic and the archivist, the overlapping roles, that actually suits me very well, because personally, I also find the isolated standalone of the critic, that position, ultimately unsustainable in terms of personal growth. It's interesting. So Corey was talking about Anglophone models of theatre criticism. Kenneth Tynan, the legendary 20th century English newspaper critic of theatre, who was with The Observer, he was known for his scathing reviews and equally impassioned raves. People said that, his reviews would make or break a show or make or break an artist, right? But interestingly, the second half of his career was actually spent in the National Theatre as a literary manager. He actually left his critic role. So I think that's quite interesting. And I feel that actually the archival role, which draws very much from a work with the community, that actually is quite nourishing and sustaining. And finally, technology and different media formats, which Xiao Yi had also raised. So this affects actually both the critic and the archivist. So recently, I had the privilege of doing a workshop on music journalism for secondary 3 students. So these are like 15-year-olds who study music at quite an advanced level in schools. And they got to write a music review. And some of them really had challenges because they didn't even know what a written music review was, a written review is. They'd not even read a review. So they had to chat GPT or Google various things and cobble together something. And it was quite, I realized that for digital natives, the Gen Zs who are growing up now, the written format may be something very alien to them. Whereas reviews in the podcast format, video essays, that is their milieu, that is something that they is closer to them, right? So the critic has to consider that. And likewise for archival, one also has to keep pace with the evolution of media format. So productions from 2 to 3 decades ago, which were recorded on tapes or CDs, if they were no longer digitized, are they watchable? And if those tapes or DV recordings are corrupted, then actually they are lost forever because they cannot be digitized. So they're essentially gone forever, right? So that's something I feel is very pressing, very incumbent on us as archivists to future-proof our collections and keep pace with technological developments so that we're not caught flat-footed like that. But having said that, I will also share there are challenges, gaps in archival research and documentation. Later on, I'll be talking about that. But in sum, as an archivist, my role is to document. And after the documentation is done, I see my role as an archivist critic as casting a critical yet future-forward eye on performance history. And I'm not working alone, but I'm drawing from a community. And the authorship may be individual. I may be the author, but the meaning making, I believe, is very much, to varying degrees, a collective act. And something which is important to me also is working in formats that can reach the audience wherever it currently is. So I'll just give a quick backgrounder on Singapore's performing arts archives, just to situate it for people outside of Singapore. So we have the outermost layer, we have the archives of individual arts companies. And I've listed some of the most active ones in terms of digitizing their collection and making it available online. That would be the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, T-Works, and the Necessary Stage. The last two are theatre companies. Then we have the kind of sector level archives. So there's Esplanade, which is which I'm a staff of, and our collection is essentially performances performances by artists from Singapore and the region staged at Esplanade, right? So there's quite a rich collection there. And then, of course, there's Centre 42, which collects physical materials relating to Singapore theatre history. And finally, the national level archives, the National Archives of Singapore and the Singapore Online Arts Repository, which is administered by the library, which collects materials relating to Singapore's cultural medallion recipients. These are individuals who have received the country's highest honor, and also materials relating to Singapore's major arts companies. This kind of gives you a reference point for what we mean when we say archives in Singapore. So archival projects I've worked on, so something that has been important to me is to keep up with format. So I started out with something like a book, right? And with reportage. I think with this project, something that was very critical was that I interviewed around 25 to 40 individuals who were movers and shakers in Singapore theatre history from the 50s to the 90s. So this history ended in the year 2000. And I mean, some of these individuals, of course, have passed on. So it was crucial that I was able to talk to them at that point in time when I did. And subsequently, I also did some research in the form of an article on the early history of the substation. This is Singapore's first independent arts center, which was founded in 1990. So an equivalent in Hong Kong would be the Fringe Club, right? Like a bastion of experimental and independent arts. And I experimented with a format which was basically edited verbatim interviews. So I interviewed 5 different people connected with the Independent Art Centre's early years, 2 policymakers, 1 indie musician, 1 theatre maker, 1 board member. So the idea was to tell the story of the substation, its early history, through their eyes. And this was quite precious because actually that physical building that you see in the picture actually is no more, because the substation essentially lost its physical premises a few years ago. Then I worked on a project, and so Pop Law, this is a documentary project on the past, present, and future of Singapore's pop music. And this was with Esplanade. And I think this is one project which, to me, was an example of collective authorship. And also, given the multilingual nature of the project, I think this collective authorship is critical, given the diversity of the subject matter and the multilingual expertise required. So, and the medium also was not a book or print, but it was a podcast. There was a 3-episode video series, and it was also an exhibition on indie music, on music venues in Singapore through the decades. And I worked with a big team. So the podcast was produced by Hong Xin Yi, who started out as a theatre critic, and Akanksha Raja, who also is another former theatre critic, did the research and writing for the exhibition. And we also had veteran Singapore music producer Lim Sik on board as consultant, and input from 5 to 6 Esplanade music producers. So all of this was very, very critical. I mean, given the diverse subject matter expertise required. So I mean, some of the things we found, so just give you a sense of multilingual and some of the translation required. For the episode on Chinese language pop, we had sound bites in Mandarin or Cantonese, and this was translated in the narration. So I mean, one key finding, for the episodes on English language pop was that there actually was like a lost generation of Singapore English language bands and songwriting in the 1970s. Basically, that whole decade, the Singapore government clamped down on rock bands because of its association with drug taking. There was a ban on long hair and all that. So the result of that was that by the time we got to the 80s, which was actually the decade that, like I was like in my early teens, suddenly on the radio, there was no more original Singapore music, English language music. And in bars, audiences would expect Singapore bands to play only cover versions of US and UK top 40 hits. So it was that dire. And although, original songwriting in English would pick from the late 80s onwards, but contemporary Singapore musicians spoke of the struggle to find, authenticity and creativity from within themselves. And authenticity and creativity are the ingredients of success in pop music world, or indeed in any art form, right? They spoke of this struggle to find this within themselves in a culture where there's a lot of pressure to fit in and to achieve success on very conventional terms. And of course, for the different, the pop music in different languages, there were also different findings. So like for Singapore Chinese pop, the 90s and the noughties, that was a golden age where pop stars and songwriters like Kit Chan and Stephanie Sun, they achieved success in the greater Chinese market by staying true to what kept them unique, while also assessing, how do I connect with listeners in Taiwan and Hong Kong? And then that's where, Singapore producers working in these markets like Billy Ko and Lisa Song were very important. So, and then for the English for the Malay and Indian pop, there was also a lot of influence from Malay cinema, from Indian cinema, which is very musical in nature. So it was different. It was very unique for each episode, and we really relied, a lot on producers who were knowledgeable about these, and that's why I say the authorship was collective. And then, you can scan the QR code if you'd like to have a listen to the episodes. Finally, so in recent years, in the literary landscape, creative nonfiction is something that so it's a hybrid of nonfiction, fictional elements like memoir as well as research and reportage. So I've also tried to go into this area, and I wrote a biographical essay on Christian Jit, which appeared in an anthology called The Second Link. It's an anthology of Singapore and Malaysian writing. So and currently, with Esplanade Offstage, so something that we're also trying to do in addition to doing like documentary videos and articles on the arts in Singapore and Asia, we are also trying to curate quality full-length recordings of performances by Esplanade and partner arts organizations to make it possible for local and regional audiences to discover outstanding performances from the region and beyond, and to explore their diverse cultural heritage. This is where the archives at the back end really helps the site. And we also have an on-site physical exhibition as well. Like the current one is actually on the interconnectedness and physical vocabulary of dance in Southeast Asia. I'm conscious of time, so very quickly, some of the challenges. A key one, like I mentioned, is paucity of archival recordings. It's often the item furthest on the back burner due to cost and priority. I think for many smaller arts companies, theatre companies in Singapore, video archival is a luxury. And even for bigger organizations like Esplanade, when budgets are cut, the video archival is the first thing to go, right? So, and then with video archival, it's not just a matter of how many cameras, but also keeping up with technological shifts. So not just from tapes to digital. Now there are also new technologies like AI. So something which I found very exciting recently, there's a Singapore choreographer, Daphne Chen. She is working with creative technologists on an algorithm which can learn a choreographer's movement vocabulary. And this is very valuable for restagings and also for archival of dance, because dance, unlike theatre has scripts, music has scores, right? Dance doesn't. So so these are AI and all that. These new technologies have come into play, and these are things that we have to keep up with as archivists. Space is also an issue in terms of physical materials. It's sad, but a lot of props, costume sets get thrown away because of space constraints, which is the primary challenge in a land-scarce city-state like Singapore. And we are all navigating this loss because of the challenges brought on by the landscape, right? And yeah, so I believe that these are the interventions that we have to make to try to offset these, you know, actively as archivists. And yeah, I do believe that the archives can address our gaps, because a performance is ephemeral. Its run is short-lived. It's over in 2 weeks, and sometimes you really regret that you didn't watch a performance. So archival recordings allow for the possibility of restagings, and also for academics, it's really a lifeline. So I wanted to quote something that a researcher who researches archives and performance, Alvin Ng Hui Lim, he's written, I mean, performance archives cannot replace live performance, that we know, but you know, a live performance can tap into an archive to gain new meanings or to refer to old ones. And in a similar manner, a performance archive extends the performance and includes new contexts for new audiences to emerge. In fact, it can bring us back to the past while keeping us rooted in the present. Our screens and stages multiply the archives as we imagine new and renewed connections with it. So my thoughts on arts discourse beyond criticism and archival. Arts discourse, I take it to be not just reviews, but also op-eds, bigger picture analysis on the state of the arts. I think the media landscape now is extremely fragmented in Singapore. And whether you think there's enough discourse really depends on who you follow on social media and which publications or e-newsletters you subscribe to. So, I mean, for example, you know, if you subscribe to JOM, which Corey is art editor of, or you know, if you subscribe to Mekong Review, which is another arts. It's a literary journal, but there are also essays on culture and politics in Southeast Asia. If you subscribe to Mekong Review, if you subscribe to the e-newsletter of Offstage, for example, if you follow these things, you may not feel that there's not enough. But if these things are not on your radar, you know, you would feel that, hey, you know, that there isn't enough, considering that you know, the scene has grown so much over the last 20 years. Traditional media have cut back on arts coverage because it doesn't bring in advertising dollars. I mean, Xiao Yi, myself, and Corey, we were just lamenting before we started that Arts Equator, which is the only performing arts media site, you know, it ran op-eds, reviews, and essays on Singapore and Southeast Asian performing arts. It has actually shifted its operating model 2 years ago. It now conducts research and documentation on censorship in the region, and it's no longer a media platform per se. And that is a big loss to the arts and culture ecosystem, you know. So Singapore essentially does not have a dedicated journal or magazine now for the arts or performing arts criticism. I think the future of arts discourse seems to be with individual writers and academics contributing to different platforms, rather than being platform or media centric. So yeah, I mean, Corey and myself continue to contribute to this discourse in our own ways. And there are also other active critics in Singapore who may be practitioners, writers, or academics. So for example, Alfian Saad or Ng Yi Sheng, Ho Su Fen, and Audrey Wong, who are academics. To sum up, I think that I see, you know, my role at the intersection of archives and criticism as addressing this gap in the ecosystem in terms of performance documentation and then reflecting critically on performing arts history through it. I think it's important to future-proof one's practice by keeping up with the evolution of technology. So whether it's criticism or archives, the different formats that people are engaging with content, it's hugely important to keep up with that. And also, I very much believe in the kind of community networks that the archival role gives me, and that feeds into criticism. I really don't think it's very sustainable to just be like a lone wolf critic operating independently in one corner, especially now that everyone wants to be part of the conversation, it's very hard to just cut yourself off like that. Yeah. So that's all I have to share. And yeah, very interested and looking forward to what others have to share, also perspectives from other countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I kept nodding my head like this. I read your articles since I was young. Although I miss your writing, but I'm also thinking that you are now doing a more important thing, which is building platforms. And it's like what you said just now, building platforms wouldn't just be about documenting and commenting on the past. It will be about how to build the future. And it's no longer just about providing content. It's also about to research and to develop the format. It's not just about commenting on the artwork itself, on the programming level, but also commenting on the the ecosystem, the art making, the cultural policy, and so on. So it's about the larger structures and larger environments. Wow, I'm so happy. I'm hosting this. Okay, thank you both. I see that some of the audience members have already asked questions. Since we have 3 reactions to Maxiam's question to Corey, do you want to respond to Max's question? As you expand the idea of criticism, do you feel the responsibility to sustain or to inspire more people? That's why she's now in Alpha.
Thanks for the question, Max. Maybe for some disclosure, so maybe I'm gonna combine a few thoughts, because I think Claire also talked about moving away from the kind of lone wolf idea, or the notion that an individual has to lead a kind of charge, right? In Singapore, the region, when it comes to advocating for a very specific kind of criticism. I do think, and I agree with Claire, that we have really moved away from criticism being kind of a singular format, right? Where we often associate it with a review written in a newspaper or a broadsheet. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. People are consuming things very, very differently now. Of course, as a writer and a long-form writer myself, I have concerns about the amount of attention and commitment people have to stay with an extended piece of written work. At the same time, I'm also really thrilled by the different formats that are emerging, right? And I think I used to feel a lot more pressure around like, oh my God, is criticism dying? Are people not reading any longer? Will they only read really short capsule 200-word reviews, 200-character reviews? But I think something that I think I'm an optimist by nature, and I often think about my writing, how my writing as a critic can create my audience. I often think, instead of thinking, what kind of reader do I have? I think, what kind of reader do I want? And then when I think, what kind of reader do I want? Then I create the reader through the writing that I write. If that makes sense. Like, I want this reader to stay with me from beginning to end, even if it's very difficult and they have to wrestle with and have the stamina to stay with a long piece of writing. It's a personal challenge to myself. Like, how can I do that? And also because I practice maybe a more expanded notion of criticism. So I see a lot of my responsibility distributed across different formats, right? So if I am moderating a post-show dialogue, then I also want to model or demonstrate a form of critical engagement with the work in the questions that I ask, the creators in how I translate maybe audience members who are trying to ask a question, but sometimes it can be difficult because you as critics, we're trained to very quickly process a work. If an audience member has watched a work for 2 hours, sometimes it can be like, oh my God, I know I want to ask something. It is very difficult for me to frame the question. And so that's where I see myself coming and be like, oh, if someone is figuring out what to ask, how can I reframe that question for the artist and for the general public? So that's another way I think about criticism. And then Arts Equator, I was their guest editor for a while and their resident critic. They also hosted these post-show dialogues where groups of critics would come in and have really deep discussions about our work, which I really enjoyed, which I felt were also demonstrating the kind of analysis you can have of a piece. So I love like anything podcasts, Instagram posts. I feel like they all contribute to the ways in which we consume work now, and including the ways in which Esplanade Offstage does their work. So I do feel a certain kind of pressure, yes, to maintain a long-term durational engagement with the scene. But I think leading and inspiring can take many different forms. My hope is that, you know, the few of us who have been doing it for some time are not the only people embarking on new and exciting ways of doing things, because that would be really boring to just see the few of us all the time. And it would be kind of indulgent to think that I'm the only person who can offer new things to a scene. So I do feel a sense of responsibility, I think, to the theatre companies or artists or you know, other people whose work I've been following for a long time. But I would hope for a more egalitarian or democratic way of responding to art. And so part of my PhD, which actually Max and Sam were a part, was convening this working group called the Critical Ecologies Working Group. I just posted a link in the chat, which is a group of 12 critics from across Southeast Asia. And it was so rich. We all came together to exchange ideas. And this was during COVID, and it really sustained us because we were so lonely during that time. It was really great for all 12 of us to come together to just talk about live performance when there was none. And to build these communities and networks, I think is really, really valuable. So I would hope to decenter the kind of notion that there's only one way of doing critique. Yeah, I don't know if Clarissa, you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would concur. I think in addition to, you know, it can't just be it can't just be the responsibility of one person. Actually, I think the real challenge is right now is that they're just not enough. That they're not enough people, right? They're not enough people. They're not enough. I mean, someone in the chat talked about resources as well. Resources put into platforms. Resources for people to practice criticism full time. You know, so while I said that I think, you know, the future in a way is about individuals, you know, on different platforms, right? But it doesn't absolve, I think, funding bodies or organizations from the need to put resources into this, because because a social media post, while a social media post from a person who is very informed and very knowledgeable can mean a lot, and there's also discussion and all that going on the thread, but it's also not a substitute for a long form, more essayistic reflection. So there are a lot of ingredients, if you like, that need to go into tilling this field beyond just one person making a difference.
Yeah, I think then it's more important to have discourse and criticism, not just on our shows, but on our cultural policies as well. And okay, I saw Max had a question for me. Is the difference in building platform versus building community? My answer can be very short. I think one-off platforms can be communities, or it's quite difficult to build communities from one-off programs or one-off platforms. So it's important to build sustainable and long-term platforms in order to build communities. That's my thought. Would you like to also respond to Max's question?
I guess we can. I mean, I think Arts Equator began as a platform, and then what was exciting was the 2 times they did the Asian Arts Media Roundtable, which both Claire and I were a part. One was pre-pandemic, the other one was during the pandemic, which was quite interesting. But I found both instances of the roundtable some of the most nourishing connections I've had with other critics in the region, right? It offered us a gathering space and really propelled Arts Equator from just being a place that housed writing about the arts to a place in which people could connect and exchange best practices, right? And struggles within this region, including censorship, including lack of funding, you know, and of course some struggles were different, some struggles were very similar. And I think those meeting points over the very intensive course of a few days where we all watched shows together were really, I think this is why people miss Arts Equator, right? Because Kathy and her team were really effective in bringing people together in that way. So I think a platform can be a really good springboard from which you can gather like-minded and also very differently minded people and be interlocutors for those people in the same place. I'm relatively new to JOM, but I think there is a great desire for the platform to also build community. They have a series called JOM Cakap, which Cakap means to like have conversations or talk. That have been very exciting to see, you know, subscribers and readers come together and see, you know, how their contributors, the writers whom they read, or the newsmakers whom they read about, respond to certain events. And so you're not just like a faceless person. I think a lot of times critics feel very inhuman or very faceless. You know, when you get very like vitriolic responses from artists, because they don't really imagine you as a person. And then when you respond to them, they're like, oh, you're a human being. And so that space where people can gather and exchange views is a very humanizing and communal process. I mean, that's what performing arts are about, right? That's why we gather and breathe together. But I think sustaining it requires a very committed group of people who want to build these relationships in the long run. It can't just be, you know, kind of volunteer work or unremunerated work to build community. So I mean, those are my initial thoughts. And I think Esplanade also has like membership programs and different kinds of events in which they try to involve people. But Claire, maybe you're better positioned to respond to that. Yeah.
No, I think community building is critical for any media site, any media brand. We're no longer in the days of print, right? Where you know, there was where an Imagine, as Benedict Addison wrote, you know, an Imagine community was formed, which was, you know, the nation state by people reading the newspapers over breakfast every morning, you know, in their homes, right? It's totally fractured now, and you have to build community in order to, as a media brand, in order to be heard amidst the noise, right? So that's what JOM is doing. I mean, Esplanade as an art center, we also have membership programs, and that's what Arts Equator did as well. Yeah, so I think it's absolutely critical. I would like to take the question, I think from Adela. Yeah. Thank you for your question. So you asked, how do I think the trend of developing digital theater technology, which changes the conventional live performance audience relationship, changes archival and the way archivists work with their analysis, right? So I have two thoughts relation to that. Actually, one is that even without technology, there are just certain performances that are by their nature resistant to filming or video archival. So immersive performances. So actually, like Emergency Stairs, Einstein in the car park, right? I actually watched a bit. I didn't get a chance to watch the live performance, but I watched the video archival. I stopped it after a few minutes. I thought, I cannot watch this performance on video archival. It's not that it was not well filmed. It was multicam recording and all. You filmed like the audiences in the car park looking at the performers, for the performances, doing their warm-ups on different angles. It was very well filmed, but I realized that it did not do justice to the performance because there was a sense in which as the audience, you were meant to be a bit lost, right? And that lostness didn't come across. And I think there are also certain immersive participatory performances, maybe like by Drama Box in Singapore, and there would be examples in other cultures as well, where it's just resistant to archival. So then I think that maybe there are other ways in which to document. So Xiaoyi, for example, you have had things like an embedded critic in the form of Corey, right? And that was in a way your means of archival documentation, right? A critic in the interior of the performance, documenting it in that way from a different perspective. So it's not reductive the way sometimes filming, multicam recording might be, right? So in that sense, video archival is not a magic bullet in terms of scholarship. There has to be other ways, and I do believe that it's important for archival to be nimble as well and to be responsive to meet people where they are. So now with digital theater technology, that's another kind of challenge. So I can think, for example, of Blindness, which was on the Esplanade Theatre stage, and it was actually audio in nature. So the audience was, I think it went to Hong Kong as well. So the audience was seated on the stage, and the action was actually taking place in audio, and it was binaural and all that, right? I mean, there was stage lighting, but it's very hard to see how a conventional video recording could do justice to it, right? So in a way, that's the future forwardness of archival. You really do need to be very inventive and creative, working very closely with the performer to reinvent and reimagine archival. But it's also a very costly exercise. And when push comes to shove, the money would go to the performance, right, rather than the archival. So it's a real struggle. It's a real challenge. But I mean, that said, a good archival can give the performance a second life. So a second or third or fourth life. So there are all these questions, as theatre makers, as arts managers that we wrestle with and grapple with. It makes our job very exciting, but it's also part of the challenge. Yeah. So I think that's what Adela's question really hits on. Yeah. Thank you.
I think that there are always more creative ways to do archives and documentation. For example, like the link sent by Corey in the chat box is a review written by her on Einstein in the car park. And I can just give you an example. For example, I just take the review and treat it as a script to create another production. Then that's how I can give you a second life or a third life of documentation, right? Yeah. Okay.
Can I raise my hand? Can I?
Sure.
Can I join in? Because I'm too tired because I keep knocking my head tonight. and I'm so agree with what both of our speakers talking about tonight. And I'm sharing some thoughts here as a arts administrator of ITC here, because we're promoting arts performing arts criticism, and also we are trying to advocate people about the awareness of documenting the performing arts history in Hong Kong. And I think one of the issue that I just came into my mind is just what Carice mentioned about how as a critics, because we are receiving a lot of new information and a lot of new theatrical experience, and all these new things is trying to break all these theater rules. And also we have to keep our mind to be fully open and also be able to absorb all this kind of knowledge and to respond to the theater or shows that we would like to criticize. And sometimes I think it's hard for me to find the tool, and also for our young critics to find the tool to manage our critics at this particular moment. Because what Carice just mentioned about blindness in Hong Kong, because I love the show very much. And also I think for me as a critic to criticize this particular performance piece is also a challenging task for me as well, because it's not a conventional form of performance, and I have to equip myself with a lot of knowledge in terms of like technology or some scenography. And I think we need more like knowledge and tool for us to be able to be a more good critics. And I think for me it's also challenging for me as well. And I'm not sure whether what do you think about how to be more like equipped to be a critics for the future?
Thank you so much for that question, Bernice, because I'm also an educator. I would love to respond to that question. So for 2 semesters, I taught a module on theatre criticism at the National University of Singapore, and they were really, really exciting semesters for me, because I really wanted to see what my students could do if they could respond to work. Like I said just now, how we talk about the work is the work. What if we watch a production and respond to it in the language of that production? I'll just send in a link in the chat. This was from the first time I taught it. I think the second time I taught it, when I had gained more experience, it was even more exciting because I knew how the pedagogy would work. Where I kind of scaffolded my students watch 3 different performances. The first one, they're just learning how to do contextualization, like understanding histories of performance, contextualizing a performance, describing a performance, because often people are not even equipped with those skills, right? How to historicize, how to describe, which I think is, we learn some of the fundamentals. The second is you collaborate with someone else and you kind of have a discussion about a work. How do you facilitate a discussion for someone else? How do you build on someone else's conversation, ask them good questions to respond to a work? And the final one is what my students always love the most, which is a creative, critical response to a production, right? So it's not captured here, but the second time I ran this module was so thrilling because I knew what prompts to give the students. And for the final work, they watched a participatory performance where audience members could vote on what the actors could do or could not do. And they found it very disturbing because I think some of the ethical boundaries of the work were not set up very well. And I mean, the responses they came up with were just absolutely astounding, because I think they are all digital natives and they have much more fluency in these platforms than we do. One of the students, because the work was about high stakes decisions between like making a performer do something that they didn't want to do, used the platform called Climb, which is a choose your own adventure kind of platform where you can click and it will bring you to a new page. And he created a work that really was like a criticism of like hyper-capitalism, where it was almost like a computer game. You would enter the game and it was responding to the work, but satirizing the work through this like game mode where you would choose different things. I mean, I was so blown away by this critical response to the work. It was probably better than the work itself. And I think it's just about giving people the toolkit to think critically about something. And I mean, they will just come up with incredible things with which to reframe your experience of something. So I think often it's about asking the right questions and offering people an array of options with which they can choose from. And you can really produce really astounding critique about something. So I have a lot of hope about that, because I'm not myself fluent in every single technology, but I feel like just by giving people a certain set of critical toolkit or a certain set of prompts of provocation, I feel like this generation of students are able to really create very phenomenal responses that I learned from when I respond to work now. how can I be more experimental in my voice, my registers, particularly during COVID, right? How can I make use of fragmented narrative, the experience of being on different screens, right, to respond to something. So for example, my colleague, another critic, Nabila Said, who's a good friend of mine and who was editor of Arts Educator for a long time, she and I watched this show digitally during COVID. And we co-wrote a piece together about our experience during a pandemic watching live performance, which I've just sent in the chat. So I'm quite excited by ways in which we can push the boundaries of critique. I think, yes, I love the long form that Clarissa talked about. There's a discipline, there's a rigor to that kind of argumentation and writing. But I'm also interested in the ways in which criticality can emerge in other forms. Yeah, I'll stop there for now because I realize there's another question in the chat. But yeah, I hope that responds a little bit to your question.
I actually have a fun question. Since we are talking about pushing the boundary in theater, in the meantime, how should the form of writing, how should the form of writing theater criticism evolve? For example, like writing a poem or drawing a flower as a criticism to another artwork, for example, like a theater piece, or what are your thoughts or opinions as educators and or editors on reviews written by, for example, AI, or even the updated version of History of Singapore's English language theater written by AI?
Claire, do you want to take this one first?
Okay, so I think that I think that there are certain elements that are fundamental to criticism. I think that that all criticism should have a mix of three elements. One is analysis, the second is context, and the third is description. So I think that whatever the format it appears in, all criticism has to have a mix of analysis, context, and description. But when it comes to format, I think that, yeah, I mean, you know, with AI and all that, I mean, everything has just, I mean, the way forward has been blasted open in a way, you know. I would not presume anymore to say that a review looks a certain way and feels a certain way and inspires a certain line of thinking or questioning in the reader. I think it's hugely open-ended. And I mean, as someone who has been writing critically about the arts half my life, it actually doesn't get easier. In anything, it gets harder. And going into creative nonfiction has tested me in ways I never imagined I would be tested. It's almost like learning how to write all over again, you know. But that said, I think that there's also integrity. Maybe that's the fourth ingredient, right? So that is where, I mean, so if if your review lacks originality, for example, because it's from AI, then that is an issue, right? So I think there's also an element of integrity. There's an ethics involved in criticism as a critic, right? I think that's important, like a professional code of ethics. So that's also something that the practice has to be tested against. And Bernie's question just now about how, you know, for critics to evolve and grow, I think curiosity is a very key ingredient as well. The openness to learning, to sometimes even start from ground zero in a particular area of knowledge, because artists draw inspiration from such diverse sources, right? That sometimes if you're closed off to a particular area of knowledge because you never thought that a work of art could be created from it, well then, I mean, it's dangerous, because if artists are making art in that terrain, then you've cut yourself off from it, you see. So I think it's a never like with all vocations, a never ending process of learning. Yeah.
Thank you. I also saw a new question, right? From Theo Chen.
I think it's quite similar to what we've responded to in terms of engaging.
How do you engage readers?
So I'm just aware that it's past 9:30, so just.
Oh.
We can allow.
I have an answer for this question.
What's the answer?
More programs, like that's how we engage.
More programs.
Maybe I'll just very quickly say something, which is that I was having a conversation with a friend who runs the Singapore International Film Festival's Youth Critics platform. And I think in Singapore, and maybe this is true elsewhere as well, we have a lot of platforms for emerging critics, right? People who are trying their hand at something for the first time. You know, we have theater criticism classes at LaSalle, at NUS, National University of Singapore. And so we have a lot of these platforms encouraging entry-level or very, very early career critics. But the problem happens when you've gone through this course, and then what next? How do you develop your voice further, right? Because when I read critics who have been through this kind of training platforms, you can see that they're still figuring out where their voice lies, right? In a whole cacophony of voices, right? What sets you apart as someone who's confident in your writing and your engagement with the scene. And I think something that I've begun to feel more strongly about is that criticism is a durational act. A lot of the time, critics do their job, and this is maybe one of the Straits Times' big flaws, is that we have very high turnover, right? People would be part of the newspaper for 3 years, and then because they can't sustain themselves, whether because they have to do everything for, not just criticism, and then outside of platforms like the Straits Times where you're not paid, right, to do criticism, it's so hard to sustain yourself. You can't really commit to a practice of engaging with work. You have to do other things. And so people who may have showed incredible promise just fall off the radar because they just really cannot sustain their practice. And so I can really count on one or two hands the number of people who have stayed the course for 15, 20 years, right? Like who have committed to this as a really significant part of their life. So I have resigned myself to the fact that I will be a critic forever, right? That is my personal commitment. Like Clarissa said, she's been a critic half her life. But it's very difficult to find people who will be like, I'm going to do this because I know no other way in which to engage with the world. I don't know whether it's like a occupational hazard or something. I know I will enter a room where a performance is happening and I will be enraptured. I have no choice. And so it is a long-term commitment. And then I feel like it's only after 10 years of writing for me that I was like, oh, I finally know what I'm doing. And then after maybe 15 years, I was like, actually, I don't know what I'm doing at all. It really goes in cycles. And I feel like now, post-PhD, I'm rediscovering myself as a critic again. And I think it really requires that kind of durational commitment. And then you can finally see what artists are doing. Because like when the first 3 years I'm following someone, I have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing, sometimes when they're starting out. And only after 15 years, maybe I can tell Xiaoyi, I think I kind of know what you're trying to figure out. I don't know what you're doing sometimes, but I know like these are the questions that are very important to you. These are the things that are a huge priority to you. These are the things that make you excited. And that's the most exciting thing for me, right? That invigorates me as a person. Even if I may be frustrated by your work or, don't like your work personally, that doesn't matter. That's inconsequential to me. The more exciting thing is like, oh, I followed this person. I've accompanied this person for a very long time. And I crave that among other writers. Like I wish there were many people who have stayed the course for, 15, 20 years and really followed an ecology for that amount of time. So I think that is something I would love if I have the bandwidth, to see if we can do as a community to support people who really are committed to these long-term engagements. Whether you don't have to be prolific or super productive, but just this commitment to be like, I'm gonna journey with you. I don't know, sorry. I
want to give you a big hug, Corey and Carice, because I'm totally understand what you're just talking about. Because as an IITC, we create a lot of platform of nurturing young writers, and also we have a lot of workshop for people who would like to write criticism. We welcome them to join, but it's just the platform. But what one of the participants just mentioned about community, it's hard for us to hold this community. It's easy for us to create a lot of platforms, but to build this community is something else. It's something else. It's something long term. We have to put a lot of energy, and we also need to work and also walk with them. It's something I think it's not only one association could do. And also I think the identity of being a critic for the young writers is particularly difficult for them to define whether I am a critic or I'm only an amateur writer, because some of them, they really don't know. Maybe it's just they're interested of writing one piece or two pieces of articles. But as you just said, I'm a forever critic. So I don't think they have that. It's just, for me, it's also take a courage to say that I'm forever will be a critic. So I think it's for the identity of being critics for the young writers in particular. It's something we may need more, like maybe the environment or the ecology has to be like more healthy or more organic for them to be able to find their position, and also to cope with this difficult situation. And I think for the young writers in particular, to be more fluid at some point, they will find more comfortable in some point. That's what I'm feeling right now for the young writers, because they don't want to, I'm not saying that they maybe they want to do something, they want to commit, but it's just keeping fluid. The fluidity is also important for them. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And I'm not sure whether it's a conclusion. I don't want it to be a conclusion or a final remarks of today's seminar. Maybe
Picking
Carice
up
can...
on Theo's question, because I think Theo asked question. In Singapore, as to counteract kind of like this paucity of archival documentation, there is a genre of performance known as archival performances, right? Like rant and rave, or the work that C42 has been putting out, where performance itself is in form of archival documentation of a particular history, a particular subset of Singapore theatre history. So like Desert Blooms is actually an archival performance documenting queer theatre. So I mean, just off the top of my head, because Critic Circle blog, and I respect the platform that Critic Circle blog has put out for young critics, and I know that some of the critics are also practitioners. What if one of the forms of criticism were to be performance itself, that takes place as a parallel response to a work? I don't know, so I mean, just like how there's archival performance, maybe performance itself could be an act of criticism. So I think there are these possibilities, and I think that's what is exciting about being a critic at this juncture. It's challenging because the landscape is so fragmented, and it's very easy to build yourself a platform, but it's hard to then find the audience. But at the same time, the channels, the formats, and all that, the possibilities have exploded, right? So I think there are these possibilities, and I would encourage the Critic Circle blog to keep experimenting and carry on with this process of engagement with the other companies and with the larger community. Yeah.
Okay, sorry everyone. As a moderator, I feel the pressure to end the session on time. I didn't expect this session would end on such a touching note. And because I promised you all to end the session earlier, but yeah. So thank you so much for the two speakers, Corey and Carissa, for your sharing. Personally, I really learned a lot from tonight's session, and I think there are so many critical topics raised. How creation can be a form of critique, and how critique can be a form of creation. How archives can be a form of criticism, and how criticism can be a form of archive. I think whether it's Singapore or Hong Kong or any other city, we talk about like funders or funding always put the focus and resources on productions or programs. But I think without critique, without archives, the impact of creativity can only remain in a very limited time and space and a very limited level. Before the session tonight, we also talk about the situation in Hong Kong. Our friends in the arts in Singapore are very concerned about Hong Kong and the criticism situation in Hong Kong. Of course, we also know that arts creation is, we are having constant dialogue with the bigger environment, and the bigger environment sometimes can be very bad. And it also gives us a lot of difficulties, but I still believe that artists and critics are more creative people, and we can always find room for creative expression. And I hope we can continue to work hard and not give up. And I want to thank Bernice and IATC Hong Kong for having us, Team Singapore.
I thank you so much, Xiao Yi and Carice, and also Corey, for wonderful and also inspiring sharing tonight. And talking about criticism and also archive, we're going to have a conference later on by the end of June. I put a link at the chat box and hope to see you soon online, because you mentioned just about the Center 42 from Singapore. They're going to be present a speech as well in the conference. So we are going to see more cases and more practices from the Singapore practitioners. So welcome you all to join the conference online, or if you are in Hong Kong, of course, please come to join us in person. And stay tuned with ITC as well, because we're going to have more interesting programs for the coming year. Thank you so much, Xiao Yi, Corey, Carice, and Corey, and see you soon in Hong Kong or in Singapore.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.